Hey there, welcome to Board Game Hot Takes, a podcast where we give our immediate reactions to the hottest board games just minutes after playing them. My name's Tim.
And this is Chris.
This is Adam.
And today we're going to give our hot take review on the game we just finished playing, The Fox Experiment. But before we do, I asked a poll on Twitter, and I'm going to talk about those results every week on Twitter. You can find us at BG_hot takes. We ask a poll question, and we get our listeners to respond, and we talk about that on the show a little bit. So if you don't follow us on Twitter, come check us out. Here's the poll question I asked. If you really like a game, are you likely to purchase the expansions for it? And the options, I buy them all. 28% responded that way. I'll buy most expansions. 48% responded that way. So almost 50% say they'll buy most expansions for a game that they really like. 22% said rarely, and 2% said never. How do you guys answer this question?
I answered this one in the minority, the largest minority. I put, I'll buy most expansions. I think that was the response that was on there. And I think initially when I first got into the hobby, I was buying every expansion for everything. And then I was like, you know what? I don't use like some of these. I think Chris mentioned Turmoil, an expansion for Terraforming Mars. I still have that in its box. I don't want to do that. I like it with the things that are there already. And Turmoil has this weird dynamic that I don't even think, well, maybe it's good. Maybe I should play it before I talk about it. But so far, I haven't even wanted to use it because I don't need it. So I'll be a little more selective these days. I'll look at the expansion, see what it does. Even the X expansion for Dune, I'm still like on the fence about that. Have I gone back to Dune since it's been out? Not that much. So I'm happy with the base game. I have the X expansion sitting there. I don't know. In this next expansion that's coming out, it's just more stuff. Like I like the base game as it is enough anyway. How many more times am I going to play it? Same thing with Spirit Island. That's another example. I have all these other spirits, all this other stuff. I'd played the Branch and Claw one a few times. That's cool. But the one that came out after that, which nearly doubles the size of everything, it's the same size box that sits right next to it on the shelf. It has, I haven't played any of that stuff. It's still in the wrapper. So as I've been in the hobby longer and longer, I'm getting a lot more selective and I'm buying less expansions.
Like Adam, I put most of them. And also like Adam, I have changed over time. I also used to buy pretty much every expansion that I could get my hands on. Now, I'm still open to the idea of buying all those expansions, but I kind of pace myself a little bit more. So if I have a game that I really like, and Terraforming Mars is a great example of that, I'll buy one expansion at a time, play it a little bit, enjoy it. Am I still enjoying it? Then maybe I'll go and buy the next one. And on and on and on for those games that have a lot of expansions until I either own all of them or I decide that I'm getting kind of bored of the game and I don't really want to keep buying expansions for them. So I think it's just a nice way to still keep myself open to buying those expansions, still getting them over time, but maybe leaving open the possibility that not every game is going to have that much staying power, and I don't want to buy a bunch of expansions right off the bat that I end up getting bored of.
Yeah, I'm right there with you guys. I'll buy most expansions for a game that I really like, and it's probably going to be most. But here's a great example, like Castles of Burgundy. When I got into it, there was like 8 expansions out, kind of mini expansions. The only one that really felt like it added anything unique to the game was the Trade Routes expansion. So I picked that up and I love it. I play it all the time, but I've never wanted to go and pick up the other expansions. Now they'll come. Most of them are just new player boards. They'll come in the big box when I get it. But for most games like Dune Imperium, Rise of Ix was a no-brainer. Like the first time we played it, I loved it. I loved it so much that when the next expansion comes out, I'm picking it up. But you guys also mentioned Terraforming Mars and Turmoil, and I'm the same. I've got Turmoil, but I've never played it. But I want to try it, and I think that's like next weekend when we all get together. If we play Terraforming Mars, I think we should just add the Turmoil expansion in, maybe with Prelude, just so we can all try it for one time and see if it adds something cool. We don't have to throw all the other expansions in there. But yeah, I think if it's a game I really love, I'm most likely to pick up the expansions just to change it up. But it does depend on the game. If it's a game that my local group is playing a lot, and I think that they'll accept expansions, then that makes sense. If it's a game that doesn't get played a lot, but I just love it. Like Gaia Project's an example. If an expansion came out from that, I love Gaia Project, but I rarely get my physical copy played. So should I really pick up an expansion for it? Maybe I will. I don't know. If it's got more factions, I probably will. I think it does pay to be selective. Here's what some of our listeners responded on Twitter. And again, if you follow us on Twitter and you leave a comment on these polls, and we may read it on the show. So the first one is from Organized Fun. This is Phil. He said, I have to get them all. It really bugs me knowing that parts of a game exist and I don't own them. Even if they're crap, I still have to own them. Phil, by the way, I just recorded a podcast with him this weekend. And when this episode released, I think 3 days later, I think that episode will be out. So me and Phil and Riley Stock got a chance to chat on the show. So watch for that coming up here. But yeah, I get it. I mean, it kind of sucks. You got a favorite game, even if you're not going to play it a lot. It's kind of fun just to have those extra pieces to it. JT said, I'm reaching a point where I'm slowing down the purchasing and focusing on making sure I own quality games. Therefore, of my 50 to 80 games I want to own, I'm more likely to grab the expansions for these than to get another unknown game. And I totally agree with that. Like, that's one of the reasons why I'm like, hey, I don't want to buy another game. It's not going to get played, but I've got this game I love. So an expansion is a fun way to freshen it up and at least make me kind of relieve that retail therapy, the drive to pick something new up. I'll just get an expansion for it. So I agree with that. Kenny Renaud said, most of my games are card games that spew out monthly expansions. My poor wallet. I'm going to touch on that in our On the Table segment in just a little bit. And then the last comment I'll read here is from Michael Corso. Kind of an opposite from what the rest of us said. He said, this day and age, games are hard to get to the table more than a handful of times. Expansions typically add to this barrier to entry with more rules overhead. I'll typically expand only for games that are already played a lot to get more variety. And that is probably the smartest and wisest comment that we read on this poll. If a game's getting played a lot and you need more variety, that's probably when you should buy an expansion. Otherwise, it's probably just going to stop you from playing it more.
That last point there, I think this is a great time to just take a step back for a second and once again say, thank goodness for BGA, because I think about all the games that if I only played my hard copy of it, I'd get them out once in a while, Blood Rage or Tapestry, those kind of games. And because they're on BGA, I get to play them all the time. I've got dozens of plays of these games. And so completely unrelated to the whole question about expansions, thank goodness for BGA. Actually, that's the thing I'd like to be able to do.
Yeah.
Buy the expansions on BGA.
I'd probably pay for a premium membership. I think I'm already paying for a premium membership. But I think to have access to expansions, like if they started releasing expansions for games, that'd be pretty cool. A nice way for them to add it in.
I would also pay for super premium.
Mega premium. Hey guys, any expansions that you consider essential or you wouldn't play, you wouldn't play the game without the expansion? And then conversely, any expansions that you're like, oh, why did I buy this thing? It kind of makes the game worse.
Oh boy. Well, that's a tough one.
Throwing curveballs at you guys.
Yeah, seriously. Expansions that I wouldn't play without. There are games where I would always choose to play with the expansion just because I've got it and why not play with it? Like Tapestry is a great example. But I wouldn't not play Tapestry just because I didn't have the expansion. So if I was over at a friend's house and they had a copy but didn't have the expansion, I wouldn't say, oh, no, thank you, because they don't have the expansion. But on the other side of your question, games where the expansion actually makes it worse. Yes, I can think of at least one, and I'm looking at Terraforming Mars again. I forget what's the one with the ships, the trading, like
There's the colonies.
Colonies. Yeah, I do not like colonies. I would choose to play without that one. I played it a couple times. Really did not like it.
There's one game where I think you absolutely need the expansion, or I would not have this game in my collection still, and that's Orleans. Solid game, interesting mechanisms, but there's a couple things that just get dull, get redundant really quick. It's the good deeds board where you scrap your tokens out and put them out there for bonuses. You just get money on it and it's not that interesting. And then the events pile is just like a few repetitive chits that you see over and over again. So Trade and Intrigue added two really important things. It adds some other modules that I almost never play with, but it adds a new good deeds board, where every time you scrap a chip and put it out there, it's a unique bonus. And it's so fun. It totally changes up the game. And then the events are like this random set of 8 events in each era. It takes a little bit of fiddliness to get it set up for the game, but every game you're going to play with different events that happen. So you never know what might come up. Completely changes the way the game plays out. And it's so much more fun with that. So I think Orleans, you have to play with Trade and Intrigue, or I definitely would have already gotten rid of it out of my collection. There are other ones that I think are really important, and if you play with them many times, they're probably good. But I could still play the games without them and enjoy them. And I'm thinking of like Champions of Midgard without the Valhalla expansion. Definitely lacks a little bit, but still fun. Lords of Waterdeep without the
Scoundrels of Skullport.
Scoundrels of Skullport expansion, right? Like that one definitely adds a lot of variability, but not necessary. The game still works without it. Most expansions are just extra add, a couple that are really important. Expansions that have ruined a game, the Wind Gambit expansion for Scythe is one that I will never play with. It just adds extra overhead and rules, which really doesn't add any fun to the game for me. So I never play with that one, even though those airships are cool. Other than that, I can't think of any off the top of my head. I do know like Anachrony is a great example of a game where, we've got the huge box of it, and it's a cool game, but it's got so many rules and everything that there's like 5 modular expansions in that box, in that big infinity box. And I really don't even want to add them in because it's already got so many rules. Now, the Fracture of the Time expansion is amazing. It's so cool, but it adds so much time and weight to the game, to what is already a heavy and long game, that it's hard to get played. So, that's an example where it's like, it's cool that they exist, but do I really need any extra complexity in this game?
I think the Fractures of Time one is a great example, and all that stuff that they throw in Anachrony. I guess it's nice that it's there, but the base game is just so good, and it has enough rules and enough going on already that I don't think it needs that. That's a good point. A couple for me, they say that I've never really played it. The Zia, Embers of a Forsaken Star, they say that kind of fixes the economy and makes it harder just to go back and forth from this planet to this planet, buying and selling goods. It prevents you from being able to do that. A little more interesting of a market there. I mentioned Spirit Island. The Jagged Earth is the latest one that has all these spirits, it just adds more. But there's so much in the base box already. So if you want more, if you're tired of the base box, then you go to Jagged Earth. But it doesn't necessarily change any mechanics or anything new. And then Rise of the Empire, a lot of people say that for Star Wars Rebellion. Add some new components, some new ships, and some new units. And then it adds a new deck. There's 2 different sets of cards you can play with. So that's pretty interesting. And it tries to change the combat, make the combat a little more streamlined. So I appreciate Rise of the Empire for Star Wars Rebellion.
Hey, how much would it suck to be a Forsaken Star? I mean, if I was a star, I'd kind of feel like, man, I've made it. I'm a star. And then to be Forsaken, I mean, how depressing would that be?
All stars are going to die someday, Chris.
Yeah, fair enough.
Let's jump into what the listeners are really here for, a description of the Fox experiment.
Few things are cuter than foxes, with the obvious exception of baby foxes, and we get to cuddle up and become cozy with both in the Fox experiment, the latest game from Elizabeth Hargrave and co-designer Jeff Frazier, kickstarting now and releasing in 2023 from Pandasaurus Games. In late 50s Russia, curious scientists pondered if foxes could be domesticated, so they began selecting foxes from the wild, foxes with so-called desirable traits. In the Fox experiment, we take the role of those scientists by first selecting the foxes and traits we'd like to replicate, modeled in the game by the selection phase of every round. In this phase of the game, players one by one select a mother fox, a father fox, and a resource spot. From this selection draft, trait chits are garnered, as are trait dice. Now players take the role of those scientists with the dice, see what I did there? And begin to align those dice together with their chits to coerce traits to the pups for that generation of foxes. Traits from the pup are now retained in a sense and used by each scientist to upgrade their capabilities, modeled here by the player boards. In a genetically perfect blend of theme and mechanics, the baby pups and their traits become parents for the next draft selection phase, and the process repeats for 5 total rounds. Along the way, players complete objectives, upgrades, compete for friendliest fox, and satisfy the demands of their patrons, all of which result in the reception of points. The player who manages the most points by game end is the winner. That's the Fox experiment by Elizabeth Hargrave, Jeff Frazier, and with lovely art by Joe Shawcross.
All right, so let's jump into the gameplay and mechanisms of the Fox experiment. This game is currently on Kickstarter, so it's not published yet. We played on Tabletopia, which is the official version of it that they have online, but it is probably still a little bit under development. As we were getting ready to play tonight, Pandasaurus put out a live stream with Elizabeth Hargrave and I think the co-designer on the game, actually, who Elizabeth Hargrave said, she kind of brought the design to Pandasaurus, but he was somebody that kind of helped develop it, and she felt like he added enough that she wanted to put his name as a co-designer on it. So anyway, a few people that got on there and did a live stream of it, and as they were kind of teaching the game on there, they're like, oh, by the way, this card, we decided to change the value on this one because it's, so they're still working on it. So we don't know 100% that we played the final version here, but it looks like it's pretty close. It has final art. It has like what looks to be the kind of completed components on there. So it was our first play. All of us played one time tonight. What mechanism stood out to you guys?
I want to talk about the player boards. All of these mechanisms tying together like they do in so many games. But the gist of the player board is there's tracks, and you're going to be upgrading these tracks. There's a lot going on there because the way you upgrade the tracks, of course, you get points as you upgrade them more. And then those can tie into your in-game goals too. But they can also tie into how many kind of wild card dice you're going to get to roll, how many baby foxes, how many little fox pups you're going to get to try and designate traits for each round. So I thought the player board, that's not necessarily a special, unique thing. Lots of games have own unique player boards, but this one is very specifically just the 4 tracks, nice and simple, left to right, upgrade them, get more stuff as you're going on. I thought that was a nice, clean design.
I agree. I like the player boards in this game. I can't say a whole lot about it because the player boards, like the rest of my game, were an epic fail for me. I did not use them to good effect. So honestly, I didn't even pay that close of attention to them, but I could see they were doing some pretty interesting things. What I wanted to talk about was the baby kit cards. I mean, this I thought was probably the most unique and interesting thing about the game, that when you have the two parents give you the dice that you roll, and then after you roll your dice, you get to mark off a certain number of traits on your baby. And so it's this sort of quasi roll and write, where the roll and write is only a piece of the game, but it's a really fun piece of the game because you get to manipulate those dice around in whichever way gives you the best combination for your babies, which brings me to the second piece of that, which is the dice rolling. Normally, this kind of dice rolling is not that exciting to me, but there's something about the way that it was done in Fox Experiment that I just thought was super enjoyable, where you're taking these and you're trying to match them up. It's almost like a little mini puzzle every time you roll the dice. And the more dice you add, I mean, it was just so satisfying having these big handfuls of dice that you're chucking around. And unlike a combat game where you're chucking big, loads of dice and then potentially getting really, really frustrated with the outcome, here there's almost always something good happening. You just have to figure out how to maximize it. So you put those two things together, the roll and write cards and the mechanism of rolling the dice and then comboing them in whichever way is most effective for you, I just thought was absolutely delightful.
Chris, those cards, I think, are the most unique mechanism of this game. And I have to call that out because what's neat about it is that this is not intended to be a roll and write game, right? This game is a full-on board game. But what the dry erase features of these cards do is it allows you to carry over from one round to the next some decision you made. And it's so cool. It's so cool that they do this. And it ties so well into the theme. I mean, we'll get into this in the theme for sure. But the fact that you can kind of carry traits from one generation to the next, and it's so elegant instead of like having a bunch of markers you're trying to do something with or tokens or something like that, you can basically carry over quite a bit of information. It's so streamlined by just putting a little check mark on these little cards with a dry erase marker. So I thought that was really cool, and I think it worked really well here. The one other thing I'll mention here, this is not a super heavy game, and so we've almost touched on all of the mechanisms already at this point. But I think there is an interesting mix of direction you can go here for points. One of the things that stood out to me is that Steve, who played with us tonight, he was really successful at meeting his objective cards, or these cards you get where you're trying to meet certain traits, and every round that you meet traits on that, then you get to kind of mark it off, and you're going to kind of maximize the points on that card. But he was able to complete like 2.5 of those cards, where I got like 1.5 completed. I think Adam got half completed, and then Chris got maybe 1 or 1.5 completed or something like that. So Steve really knocked it out, and he got a ton of points from those, but he didn't even win the game because there's also points you can get by, doing those upgrades on your player board that Adam mentioned, where the higher you get on there, some of those are going to be worth points. There are the patron cards. If you upgrade and, kind of get these patrons, they have benefits you can get to. But I managed to get a lot of points by just having the most traits, kind of the friendliest foxes in each round, which gives you a couple extra bonus points every round that you can do it. So for what is a pretty simple game, there was a pretty interesting mix of strategies you could go towards, a lot of different directions, a lot of ways to find points in this game. So I thought it worked really well from that perspective. I definitely didn't feel like, yeah, you have to just go and do this one thing. It felt like there's a lot of options in this game.
Yeah, you touched on the baby foxes. We've been talking about the baby foxes and why those are so cool. And that ties into a little bit of the draft that each round starts with.
Oh, yeah.
So what happens there is that, so let's take the second round, for instance. Those foxes that were babies in the first round get put into the draft in the second round, and now those foxes that were babies are the parents for the next round. How cool is that? So that's stepping into theme a little bit, and that's just a perfect marriage of mechanics and theme, I think, right there. But so now you have the choice between, you want to take a daddy fox or a mommy fox, or are you going to go for the resource track, which also ties into play order? So I thought that simple, it's not simple, it's a tricky draft at the beginning of each round with some interesting choices to make. How good is that little baby fox? Do you want to grab that first, or do you want to get best choice in the next round? So a lot of fun, interesting choices with that draft phase at the beginning of each round as well.
Yeah, Adam, I'm so glad you brought that up. And in fact, that was probably my favorite part of each turn. And I think what they did here, aside from just drafting, the cards, which is always fun, drafting's fun, but the fact that you also get to make the choice, do I want to make the choice of drafting one of these two cards, or do I draft that resource track, which sets your turn order token? And this reminded me a little bit of the wake up track in Viticulture, which I love, and I've never seen another great first player choice like that, where it's like I can take the best benefit, or one of these cool benefits, or I can go earlier in the round. And this actually made it even more interesting because every round, the benefits that you get in as being second, third, or fourth player, or even fifth player, if you were playing with 5 players, is variable. It changes every round. So it kind of changes what the value is on those things. But if you go first, you don't get any additional benefits. And if you go, I think it's fourth, then you get an additional benefit beyond what that variable card is. Fifth gives you the same thing. So super fun. But if you kind of forgo that and say, hey, I really want the best mom fox and dad fox, somebody else grabs all those other benefits, it's like you're giving that up. But if you grab one of those resource tracks first, then you're giving up the better foxes. That was such a cool choice. And again, very simple, right? It's 3 simple choices to make, but fun every time. And always like, Chris, you took that right out from under me. Even though I had that choice last time, but I had to pick the other one. So this was a great use of drafting not only cards, but drafting a whole bunch of decisions in one simple round.
Tim, you touched on something that I was going to say in terms of that drafting, and in particular, the draft regarding the turn order. And I agree with you. There's a lot of fun stuff happening there, just like in Viticulture, but I don't think I've ever seen a game where the turn order was potentially as impactful as it is in Fox Experiment. And part of the reason for that is because the cards are in part created by the users. So you're putting out the babies from your last round, they get into the market and people can draft in the next round. So you could have an absolutely killer card in there that's better than anything else out by a factor of 10. And if you're not the first player, you're not going to get that card. So I think a lot of times when turn order is a factor, it's not as much of a factor because there's some built-in parity, because the game designers aren't going to put a card out there that's ridiculously overpowered. It's not the case here because the users are creating those cards. And that really made, a couple times I ended up in the fourth place in the turn order. And man, did I pay the price for that. I was getting these garbage foxes and you guys were getting these super sweet. And it just, I went down a long tailspin on that one. But
is it garbage fox? Is that just a raccoon?
Yeah. Well, on that one, no one to blame but myself. I was drafting raccoons when you guys were out there drafting these golden foxes. Yeah. It's just an interesting dynamic. Next time I would definitely pay more attention to that track, the turn order track.
So another mechanic in this game, as you're dabbing off your fox traits, there's squares and circles on there. So squares is how many dice that fox is going to be worth when it gets drafted in the next round. And circles are how many chits you get to collect immediately. So you're marking these things off with a dry erase, and then you're like, okay, looking at this. And then you have to go and collect all these little chits. And then you can use those chits to either, that's what you use to upgrade your player board, or you can
use them to supplement like a dice in the next roll. Like you can add that to a trait for a dice. Yeah.
to complete a half token, a half face of a dice value to get yourself further along on a fox trait. There is a lot of back and forth, grabbing these chits and daubing these things off and trading them back and putting them here and putting them there. So there's a lot of reaching and grabbing and putting back, and there's a lot of chit exchange going on here.
There's definitely a lot of chit happening here.
Getting dicey. Chris.
No, I agreed. I thought that there was a little bit too much with the chits. I mean, it's a pretty minor complaint, but it was a bit of a complaint. We were also playing it on an online format, so that made it even harsher. It probably wouldn't be as bad in real life. One other pretty minor complaint that I had was about the upkeep phase or the research phase. I forget what they call it. It's the place where you actually take your dice, you organize them, you mark off your spaces on the kit cards. And I've said kit a couple times now. For anybody who doesn't know, a kit is a baby fox. But it all happens simultaneously for every player. So when the selection round ends, the selection part of the round, everybody goes back to their corner and does all their stuff, which is good in theory because I don't need to sit and wait while you're doing your stuff and you're putting your kits together. But there's also the potential that you could sit there for a while waiting if you have someone who's trying to do something really complex or has a bunch of things to think about. I mean, there was a couple times when, I got up and went and got a drink or went to the bathroom just because, somebody had to take their time to do something. And you can't begrudge them that because it's an important part of the game and you have to have the freedom to do that. But it did get a little bit drawn out a couple of times. Minor complaint. I don't think it ruined the game, but it was definitely a factor for me.
Yeah, and I think that's going to happen towards the end of the game specifically, maybe third, but probably fourth and fifth rounds, because that's when people all of a sudden they have two foxes, so they have to roll the dice, two or more. I think Steve had 3 cubs at one point. You roll the dice, you mark off one fox, and you roll them again. So you're kind of doing multiple times, and if the other people only have 1 or 2 at that point, then you're going to be waiting for them to do that. I agree with you guys. Like, it wasn't just the chits. It was like all the different dice you have to pull out of the piles every time, roll those, and then put everything back. There's a lot of little bits, a lot of components here you're dealing with. And I agree, probably the biggest complaint. I don't think it's major. It's not only about the fact that it just adds time and just kind of fiddliness to the game, but I think this game is a reasonably medium weight game. I think it's going to be very approachable for most players, but I think you put all those components in front of them and it all of a sudden starts to feel heavier. So for us, like, it doesn't add so much weight that it makes it complicated. But I can tell you that if I'm going to sit down and teach this to my wife, if I'm going to teach this to Jen, where they don't like learning games, now I have to explain what all these different components do. And then every time you got this clutter of components, everybody got like 15 dice in front of everybody. You got a bunch of chits everywhere. Like, it just adds a weight that the game rules themselves don't add, but just having so much stuff on the board. I think Wonderland's War struggled with this a little bit. And after many more plays, I think it continues to struggle with it. And I think the Fox experiment is going to be just pinged a little bit for that kind of, entry or mid-weight gamer because of all the stuff you're dealing with here.
Yeah, the dice, it kind of approaches Cubitos range. I think at the end, Tim, you're rolling, I'm counting 10 dice I see in front of your player board. So you're going to have to be grabbing all those, organizing this, organizing that, and then you're rolling them up and then manipulating them, shaking them around, matching this and matching that. So yeah, it gets a little dicey. There's a lot of dice going on here, especially at the end of the game when you're going to be rolling 10 dice 3 different times like Steve was doing.
All right, well, let's jump into the theme and production of the Fox experiment. And I just want to point out here that this is Elizabeth Hargrave's 4th published game, as far as I understand. Hargrave, of course, hit the scene with Wingspan, which is a huge hit, continues to be a huge hit. And anytime you see a designer come out with a game that's a huge hit, you have to say, like, does this person have a second trick in them? Or is this all they're going to do? And you also see a lot of really popular designers who come back and they publish another game and it's an iteration on something they've done before. And you can see this even with people like Uwe Rosenberg and Stefan Feld. And there's so many game designers who they do a great game, they come back, they do something that's kind of slightly different from it. And I'm really impressed with what Elizabeth Hargrave has done with all 4 of her designs, taking something that she's interested in. Clearly, she's got an interest and a knowledge about natural science, about wildlife, and she's made 4 completely different games with them. I was blown away by the Fox experiment and how well it works compared to Wingspan. Was an interesting design, not super unique, but then she did Tussie Mussy, which was a small little 18 card game, but simple, completely different rules. And then Mariposa, which was this game about butterflies migrating across North America and migrating back, completely different mechanisms. And now the Fox experiment, she did it again. She took a completely different theme and then made a new set of mechanisms to fit within that theme, and it works really well. So kudos to Elizabeth Hargrave for from my perspective, having 4 very good, successful, unique hits on her hand here. The Fox experiment, for me, my favorite of the themes that she's picked. I think this is one of the coolest game themes that I've ever seen. What do you guys think about the theme of the Fox experiment?
I know that Chris has a great story about the theme here. Just before I turn it over to him, it's basically a game about domesticating foxes, which I knew nothing about. And you have a little anecdote, Chris.
Yeah, I knew nothing either, but I was telling my wife about this. She's a fan of Wingspan as well, Elizabeth Hargrave Games. And I said the name of the game was The Fox Experiment. And I said, well, it's about this thing in Russia. And she goes, oh, yeah, of course, The Fox Experiment. And she's a veterinarian, so she probably is more aware of these things than most people. But it was something that she knew. And actually, it prompted me to go and look this up. And there's a really nice summary of this in the Scientific American that you can get online. It's a short article, a short, very non-scientist article that for popular consumption that tells the story of this experiment and how it came to be. And it's really quite interesting. So I definitely recommend that. But I want to go back to something that Tim said.
I was just going to jump in and say that the rulebook, the intro in the rulebook, it's a prototype rulebook, so it may change, but it actually tells a little bit of this story. And one of the things that I found interesting is it's not just about this experiment, which is fascinating, but it's also about the fact that this was full of political intrigue, because apparently in Russia at the time this was going on, the government had a different view of some very non-scientific direction for their scientists, and apparently pushed back on this and ended up executing, I think, the brother of the primary scientist in this, because he, wouldn't stop doing this work. But they continued to push through. So these Russian scientists who were just like, hey, I just want to do my science. I got this plan, right? And they pushed through on it. And apparently some of this work is still being done today, which I kind of want to dig into further. Maybe Chris knows more about that.
I don't really know more about that beyond what I said, but it is a fascinating story and it's definitely worth looking into. And I really give Elizabeth Hargrave props for doing that, for taking another interesting natural sciences theme and putting it into a board game. And I want to go back to something that Tim said, and it was about mechanisms and theme. And I think that Elizabeth Hargrave, one of the things that we've learned about her after a few designs now is that she is a master of inserting theme and meshing it with the mechanisms. And I don't just mean taking a game and putting a cool theme on it, but just making them so enmeshed. I mean, the fact that you're rolling these dice and you're getting these traits that then move on to the next generation of foxes. And then that generation leads to the next generation and on and on and on. I mean, that's so fun from a board game perspective, and yet also scientifically sound in terms of how genetics actually works. And I think that's great. I saw the same thing a million times in Wingspan. I think we've talked about great mechanisms and how they tie in with themes. And I think Wingspan is probably the game that I've used most often as an example of that. And I think this game is even more so because the theme and the mechanisms are so tightly wound together that you really can't pull them apart. And it just makes for such an engrossing and engaging experience that I thought it was terrific.
I can't agree with you guys more about how well the theme and gameplay are tied together here. I mentioned it with the kids. They become the parents the next generation. How fitting is that? And then you have I guess they're called Patreons, or more like philanthropists, I think, that are donating money to fund the research. It's just fantastic the way the theme is blended here with the gameplay.
Yeah, and my last note about that is one of the other neat things about it is, you've got these generations carrying these traits down, but it is kind of random, right? Like that's how genetics works. And so you have to roll dice to determine how, obviously you got better odds of hitting this trait if the parent has the right trait in it, but it's not 100% successful. So they had to include some amount of luck or randomness into it, and it just fits perfectly there. Now let's talk about the production here. I think this is such a beautiful game. I love the custom dice, right? These are customized dice. They're not typical 6-pip dice. They all have unique icons, beautiful colors. But one of my favorite parts about that, well, God, I could keep going. The Fox art's great, of course. I love the main board, though. If you look at that, because this, of course, was set in like Siberia in the 1950s or 1960s. And the board is this big kind of snowy landscape, but over to one side, you can see all these scientific building structures over there. And then the rest of it's kind of like, snowy forest area. But it's just beautiful. The whole thing, you see this thing on the table, and it's exactly the type of production I want in a board game. I want some color. I want some brightness. I want something that tells a story. The patrons are, of course, over in the scientific buildings. The foxes are all over on the side where the snow is out there, and that's where their enclosures are. Cool production here. I really like it.
Agree, Tim. From the art to the iconography, everything is just fantastic. We mentioned it. The chits are a little, they do their job. They're circles, and you put them on the player board to block the spot that you want to upgrade, so they do their job. But yeah, the art is fantastic. The gears are fantastic. They're going to have little metal gears that you can get as part of the Kickstarter process. But it's fantastic. It's nothing huge and expansive. There's no minis. There's no plastic troops marching around, so Chris already hates it. But everything else about this game, it fits for what's going on here. It's really nice.
Despite what Adam just said, I will just finish off by saying this is a game that could have gotten away with a really crappy production, and they didn't. They got a great production out of it, and I think that is another really nice part of this game.
One last note that I don't usually think about because I don't deal with color blindness, but it does seem like this game, they offered some nice touches on accessibility, primarily because all of the components are pretty much double or triple coded, meaning the icons to represent a character trait is both represented by color, it's represented by a shape, and it has an icon in there. So it should be very easy to distinguish regardless of color blindness issues. Yeah, awesome production. So let's ask the final question here. Would you request to play the Fox Experiment again?
Yes, I would request to play this one again. I had a miserable grasp of the rules and what was going on for the first 2 or 3 rounds of this game. I finally started to get it round 4 and round 5, which resulted in me getting a whopping score of 6 points. Didn't quite break that double-digit barrier. So I want to come back. I want to see what it's like to score 10 points or more in this game and get into those double digits and claw my way up. Yeah, just the way everything blends together here. There's a lot going on. I think there's enough for a handful of plays, so I would love to play this one again.
Hey, Adam, I just tripped over into the double digits, and man, let me tell you.
What does it feel like up there, right?
It feels good, yeah. No, I also really want to play this game again. We were playing it on Tabletopia, and between the fussiness of the online format and I was having some internet issues, I think, it was nearly unplayable for me. And so I actually am really jonesing to play this one again because I don't feel like I got the full experience. I was able to see how things worked and make some judgments about the various mechanisms and whatnot, but I don't feel like I really got a chance to enjoy the game. And I really want to do that. In fact, I think I'm going to go and check out the Kickstarter campaign and see more about it because I may back this one.
This was one of those games, last week we had a poll question asking about if there was a game that you didn't expect to like, but you end up liking more than you did. So when I first saw the table presence of the game and heard about the theme, I was like, this is awesome. I want to check this game out. I'm really excited about it. And then I read the rules on it and watched a kind of a playthrough today. And I was like, oh, I don't know. This game might be a little dull. It might just not have enough going on. It might not be weighty enough for me to enjoy. And I was so wrong. I loved it. I had a great time with it. I think it's easy to get into. I think there's a lot of fun decisions to make. Yeah, you got to deal with some randomness, but it's not too heavy and it fits right into the theme. And the game, I think the game, like we ripped through our first game, even with us like struggling through a prototype rulebook and stuff. I bet this is a 45-minute play for 4 players, maybe an hour max. So it's a quick game. I think this is a great game. I think this is probably, and I know we're going against Wingspan here, but I think this is probably Elizabeth Hargrave's best design so far that I've seen. I hope it has legs. I think it's an awesome game. Will I back it on Kickstarter? I don't think I'm going to back it on Kickstarter because it's probably not a weight of a game that I'm going to be choosing to go back to a lot, but I'm going to have a fun time playing it. And what I think is going to happen is like the people I play the most with, it's my wife and it's my friend Jen. And this is a game that's exactly the weight that they want. And they want a game that's got a cool production that does not a trading in the Mediterranean game from like 200 years ago, right? So it's going to get them excited about the theme. So I think this is going to be a great game for them, but I'm not so psyched about it that I want to go and back it on Kickstarter. But I think I will be watching for this when it comes out to retail. I'll probably end up picking this up at some point, and I think it'll be a game that gets a lot of plays, and I'll be looking forward to it. All right, let's jump over to some games that have been on our table and some future takes right after this. All right, welcome back, everybody. So let's talk about what's been on our table this week. I'm going to start with just a couple quick kind of callbacks to some future games some past games that I've talked about, and then I'll pass it on to you guys, and then I'll circle back with an actual on the table segment. Two things. One, last week I talked about Arkham Horror, the card game, and I mentioned I was having a lot of fun with it, and I thought I'd pick up an expansion for it. So I want to tell you a little bit about that experience, because I think it's important to understand that Arkham Horror, the card game, is what they call a living card game. The idea being that you buy it, you play a couple times, and then you got to buy an expansion for it and kind of keep adding content. And that's Fantasy Flight's entire kind of business model with this game and a few other series of games that they have. So I was at my local gaming pub this week, played some games, one of which I'll be talking about shortly, but they have a little game store in front. I was like, well, I want to pick up another expansion for Arkham Horror, the card game. And they have a ton of Arkham Horror card game content there. Now, this game was originally published in a mode where you would buy, if a new campaign came out, they would release them every couple months, you would buy a box, and I think it was about this one was $29.95 for the box, and it would come with a few new investigators you could play with, some new cards you can mix into your player decks, and one story from the campaign. And then they would start to release booster packs after that. So every time you wanted to play another story in the campaign, which might be like an hour and a half of gameplay, you buy another booster pack. But I had never looked into the pricing on these before. So this next campaign that I was recommended, I asked some people on Twitter, what should I buy next? They said, get the Dunwich Horror campaign. If you were to do this a year ago or 2 years ago, you would buy this box for $30. And then each of the expansion packs, and there's 8 scenarios in the box, are $15 a piece. So do the math on that. That is, somewhere around $120 or something like that, plus to buy this next campaign, which is probably going to give you about 7 or 8 hours of gameplay in here. But it's all cards. There is nothing else in those boxes. It's packs of cards. So I didn't know what to expect from a pricing perspective. Now they just came out with this revised kind of version of it where they're now releasing it. You don't have to buy all these booster packs. You can now just buy the Dunwich Horror campaign box, and it has all 9 scenarios in it, but it doesn't include the investigators or the extra player cards. They have the campaign box, and then they have the investigator box. So the campaign box, $69.95. It was 600 cards, I think, or 900 cards, but it's basically like a stack of cards about this big. It comes in the same size box as the original base box does. So it's a big, open, empty box with about, a handful of cards in there for $70. So
it's like 10 cents a card?
Yeah, something like that. And then you don't get the investigators in there. So if I want to buy the investigator pack and get some more cards that I can mix into my investigator decks to improve on them, I think it's another $40 or $50 to pick that up. They unfortunately didn't have it in stock. I accidentally bought the original version, so I had to return that. I bought the old, base campaign box with it. So it's like $120, $130 to get a campaign of this. And there's a whole bunch of campaigns with it. But so I think it's worth mentioning because I talked how much I liked the game last week, and I still do. I really enjoy it, and I can't wait to try this campaign. But if you decide you're going to buy more content for it, it's a lot of money. You're going to be going in for a lot of money for not a lot of physical components. Now, the story's great. The gameplay's cool. Like, I may appreciate this, but I got to tell you, this is the least value from a physical component perspective than I've ever seen in a game. To get this little pack of cards for $70 was pretty ridiculous.
So, Tim, this is something that's kept me away from all of these living card games. It's just an ongoing, here's the newest deck. You got to buy this one if you want to keep up. Isn't this just Magic the Gathering in different form?
Yeah, it kind of is. I mean, I think their whole business model is like, let's find something we can hook people on and keep selling them on it. Now, from my perspective, I'm guessing this is I think there's 9 campaigns in here. And I think there's like branching routes. So you can play once and you don't get to play through all the different 9 packs. You might only play through like 5 or 6 of them. That's the way I understand it. I suspect that for me, I'm probably not going to play this game 30, 40 more times. So I'll probably be fine. I got this one more expansion. I'm probably play through this campaign once or twice, and I'll probably never need to play it again. So I think I'm okay with it. But yeah, I mean, if you feel like you want to go in and just like collect it, then you're going to be in for a lot of money. I think people are doing that with Marvel Champions now. Marvel Champions is the other collectible card game they're doing, and they're selling them as like hero packs. Now, what I like about Arkham Horror in comparison, why I'm glad I went down this route instead of Marvel Champions, is that it's literally like a story. You know, like you're going in there, you're getting to hear it. You're getting to experience a story that you're going through and playing the game. Well, Marvel Champions is more of like one-off, like, hey, I'm dueling against this bad guy with this new character. And I'm watching some people online, some of them who will be listening to this show, I'm sure of, who will be, are like every week they're like, hey, there's a new character pack out. I'll $10 more. I'll just pick up this character pack so I can play it some more. I don't see playing the game enough to want to follow through and collect all the content for it. But I do think the Arkham Horror series, because it's kind of like these stories that it's telling, is pretty cool. I did go, though. I went to the store to return the one pack that I got accidentally, and I'm talking to the owner of the store, and he got so excited because it's like, hey, did you know this new campaign came out? I've got a 4-player game that's about to set up this week. By the way, if you did the Dunwich horror one, here's what you should count on. Make sure to get the stats like this in the deck because it's a rough campaign. Make sure to do this thing. Like, he was so enthusiastic about it. So I can tell that this is like a game that people are really into and they can't wait for the next set to come out. I don't see playing it that way. Anyway, just wanted to circle back on that and warn people that there's a lot of cost potentially here if you want to go through and kind of keep going down this route.
So, Tim, let me put you on the spot because you said this is probably the least value for the physical production of any game you've seen. So answer this for me, yes or no. Was it money well spent?
Well, I haven't played through the campaign yet, Chris, so I'll try to answer that later after I've had a chance to play it a little bit more. I think it can be. I played just through the first 3 scenarios in the first campaign, and I was really blown away by how successfully they managed to put together this story and this gameplay. And I don't think you should just put a value on physical components when you're talking about experience, right? I mean, like, experience matters, but still, I don't know that experience matters this much. So I'm yet to tell you whether it was really worth $70 to spend on this campaign box, and especially if I ended up buying the extra investigators to add some variability. Is it worth $130? I don't know. I think it's definitely on the fringe. I was there and I saw the price on it, and if I wasn't just like, I kind of determined to go there that day and say, like, I'm going to help my local game store. I'm going to buy something from them because I play at the store all the time and I really never buy anything. So I was kind of determined to do that. I probably should have just gone to Game Nerds. It's like $50 there. Could have saved $20 on it. I don't know, Chris, whether it's actually a good value from a gameplay perspective yet. Probably depends on how much you're actually going to play it. If you're just going to buy it and then like rarely ever get it out, like we do with some Euro games that we pick up, then probably not.
That's interesting, Tim. Well, not much has been on my table lately, only the virtual table. I'm in love with Barrage. It's on Board Game Arena. I keep playing it over and over and over, picking up games whenever I can and getting my butt kicked, but enjoying every second of it. Can't get enough of Barrage. Just want to report back and keep you posted on my momentum for Barrage.
Well, I'm going to keep that Barrage momentum going because that's my on the table this week as well. But the thing that's special about it for me was that it wasn't just online. I've been playing it online pretty continuously since we reviewed it, but I finally got a chance to get my physical copy out on the table for a 2-player game with my wife, who's generally okay with but not super excited about new heavyweight games. And looking at BGG, I think this might be either the heaviest or closest to the heaviest game that I've ever played. I think it's a 4.06. So anything over 4, I'm at some pretty serious stuff.
That you've ever played or that she's ever played?
Possibly that I've ever played. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at all the weights of the different games I've played. But this game is a pretty heavyweight game. And one of the things that I was concerned about was teaching it because she hates to learn new games. She enjoys playing them, even the ones that kind of cross over into the heavyweight territory she can enjoy. Terraforming Mars is another good example, but really dislikes learning them unless there's a really good rules video. She doesn't consider me to be a really good rules video. So we sat down and we started playing it. And for a few minutes, I thought I was going to lose her. But as we kept going, it started rolling. She started asking questions like, oh, but if I do this, then... And it ended up being a really lovely experience. She enjoyed it a lot more than I expected to, especially. And that to me was a great testament to the fact that this game has some, I think, broader appeal than you might guess by its complexity rating on BGG. And it makes me a little bit more willing to potentially show this game to people that aren't heavyweight gamers, because I think there is kind of a logic to it and a flow that gets going that is both a lot of fun and relatively intuitive. So lots of fun playing the physical copy. I love seeing those dams starting to stack up on top of each other. It's a lot of fun pushing those little drops of water around. Really good time. It translates beyond just BGG, and I'm really happy to see it.
I have to mention, though, Adam has had his physical copy on the table. I know this because one time we were playing on Board Game Arena, and he sends us a picture, and it's the exact layout of what our current gameplay is on Board Game Arena. So he had literally set up the physical production and was like following along with it. And I love that.
Nice.
I think it helped. That's like one of the few times I've actually won. I had to follow along going, and I pulled it out. Now, Chris, I got a question for you. Is this a game that you would play? I know you have a group that you play with up there in the Portland area of Keynesians. You think that group would enjoy this game?
I think there are a couple people in that group that would enjoy it. I think there are also some people who would not. They tend to like and play slightly lighter weight games, shorter games. And so I think this one might break the time barrier. I mean, we played Blood Rage, and that was longer than most of the games that this group plays. I mean, the Kinesia games are usually pretty quick, down and dirty. So I think that could be an issue, but I certainly think that given enough time that some of the folks would really enjoy it. And so far, I mean, I haven't met anybody who hasn't enjoyed it. So that probably means something too.
Interesting.
All right, cool. Well, the one other game that I want to talk about that is new to me that was on my table this week, and that is Boonlake. This is a new Alexander Pfister game. Boonlake has a lot going on, so I'm not going to get into all the mechanisms. I will say, though, that I was very pleasantly surprised by it because I've been kind of hit or miss with Pfister. I like Great Western Trail 2nd Edition. There's like a little tile placement game that he's got that I like a lot that I've played many times. But otherwise, I've been kind of okay on his games. Boonlake does some of the things that Great Western Trail and Maracaibo does, which that it has like the kind of this path around the board that you're following. But I think it fixes it. I think it finally solves the thing that I don't like about that, and that you're not kind of like, hey, I'm just going to go as far as I want to, or I could stop earlier and get a bonus, but I can go as far as I want to and more likely push the end game or whatever. This works in a little bit different way in that it's got a really clever action selection mechanism where there's this kind of tablet of tiles that are maybe there's 8 to 10 tiles up there, and each of them has a different action listed on it. And the tile at the top is going to give you the most movement around this board. So if you take the top tile, you can move 4 spaces on this kind of canal system that you've got. But every space on the canal system just has a bonus on it. None of them are specific actions you're going to. So the difference is that the movement is not driving the actions you can take. The movement is just giving you different bonuses. So you may want to move forward further just to get to a different bonus, or get more options for bonuses, versus if you take one of the tiles down at the bottom of this little strip, you might only move 1 or 2 spaces and you just have less options for bonuses. So it definitely, it has that kind of same big rondel experience, but it doesn't feel like that rondel is driving your actions. What's really driving the actions is this little tile system. The second cool thing about the action selection mechanism is that each of these tiles has a main action on it, but then it's also got a secondary action. And so it's kind of got a lead follow mechanism like things like Puerto Rico do, or Empires of the Void. But it's more interesting than any of those other games I've played because the first action is pretty big. It's important. The second action is still useful, but it's completely different from the main action. And then everybody gets it, except for the most powerful tile, only the other players get it. So everyone was engaged because whoever's taking that action, everyone else is starting to think like, okay, he took that action. That means I get to do these things this turn. And you're kind of all doing it simultaneously. You're all engaged. You're all staying active in the game. And then there's a really fun kind of hand management and tableau building component to this game where you've got this hand of cards and there's only certain ways you can draw cards, but based on the action you select, there's certain icons on them, so you can only play certain cards in that turn to get the most benefit out of it. A whole bunch of fun stuff going on here. Not super complicated. The turns move pretty quickly. I really like this game. I think I might like this more than Great Western Trail, actually. I think it's going to be a little bit less approachable, although Great Western Trail is complicated enough on its own to get into for the first time. But I think Boonlake is just a little bit more. There's a lot of little edge cases. This is probably a great example of just a lot of modern Euros today that really should have been developed down, remove one or two things, and this is no exception. You could have removed one or two little components or mechanisms out of this, and it wouldn't have hurt the game, but it would have made it a little bit more approachable. And so I think it suffers there, but it was a really fun experience. I had a great time playing it. Lots of fun decisions to make all the time. I think this was an evolution on some of his past designs in a way that I think really worked. But maybe the next evolution will be a little bit more streamlined and will really get us another big hit like Great Western Trail was.
A couple comments on this one, Tim. You've been doing a lot of Alexander Pfister lately. It seems like. Any particular reason why?
No. This one, for example, this was just some local friends who picked it up and said, hey, we really loved playing it last week. You want to play with us this week? So they just happened to be a hit. The other game that I played recently by him, it just happened to be on sale. So I picked it up. I mean, I think, I guess I've been intrigued by his designs lately, but it's not like Alexander Pfister as a designer really drives me. Like I wouldn't consider him one of my favorite designers, but I think now, having played quite a few of his games, I definitely am starting to more and more find that he's got some things that I really like in his design. So now I am a little bit more interested to search more out. But yeah, this was a hit for me. I really like Boonlake.
And to be clear, this is the Boonlake that's the Lost Civilization, not the Boonlake in Piney Flats, Tennessee.
I don't know. Is that something should I know the difference between the two?
No, that was just sarcasm.
What's interesting about this game is, so what is the theme on it? Nobody can answer that question. It looks like you may be trying to build up like ranches in the Old West, maybe. But Boonlake, from what I can tell, I didn't read the kind of the lore of the game, but what I can tell from the game board is that basically you've got this like series of locks and dams and rivers that are going around in this big rondel on the board. But right in the middle of it is this segment. There's kind of 4 segments of the board that are labeled, and one of them is labeled Boonlake, and that's the one big one in the middle. But it's not a lake, but it looks like what could have been a dried up lake. So from my perspective, I think Boonlake is an old like dried up lake because they rerouted all the water around the lake. So it's kind of it's interesting that it's named this way because there's no lakes in the game. I don't know if it's telling a story of a real region of the country. I don't know if it's telling a story of a particular time period, but it's kind of like just a like little civilization building game. Kind of the things you're doing with your actions tend to be like, hey, I want to first put a rancher out on the board, and then the rancher gets me a bonus, and then I can upgrade that rancher into a house, and then that house can be upgraded into like a factory. And then I can put cows next to my factory and they get me points, or I can put cows next to my house and they get me coins. So you're building up on these little regions of the board. It also reminded me a lot of Praga Caput Regni, actually, for a couple reasons. One is that there's these hex tiles that you put out on the board, and I think it handled those better than Praga did. And that, almost a lot of things that felt the same, like hex tiles you put out there, you get a bonus when you place them. You get bonuses for where, their other things are placed around them. There's a few different regions on the board. So that was all very similar. And then the second thing was the action selection mechanism, kind of like in Praga, where when an action gets used, it gets moved to the bottom of the board. And then if the next person wants to use that, they get a little bit of a negative benefit from it. But if you use an action that hasn't been used for a while, which is up at the top of the board, you get an extra benefit for it. So it's very similar to that wheel in Praga, where if you take the action that's kind of moved further around and less people have taken it, then you get an extra added bonus. So it had kind of that similar, but this worked a lot better to me. And then instead of like the little hex engine building in your player board where you had like this hex that you were kind of building tiles around, this was a card tableau thing where you're kind of building up a little tableau of cards that gave you benefits. But it had a similar resource production mechanism, which was a little bit improved. So this reminded me of Praga, but was a lot more fun, and I think worked better than Praga did. Even though this isn't, the same designer, but it felt like they were kind of playing with some of the same ideas.
Yeah, looking at it, I was reminded of Praga. So that's interesting that you made that comparison. I mentioned that you've been playing some other Alexander Pfister games. Oh My Goods, is that the one you're thinking of, Tim?
I played the kind of the second version of Oh My Goods, which was called Expedition to Newdale, but it's like a board game version of Oh My Goods, which is a card game.
Okay. So, and then he also did Mombasa, which is one of his bigger ones, which I believe is going to come out again as a re-theme here in the next couple of years. I might have that wrong.
Yeah, I think it's called Sky Mines, and I'm actually really excited about that because I've heard great things about Mombasa, but I have zero interest in going out and like colonizing Africa. But this one is basically, it's like a futuristic, like you're building mines on the moon or planets or something like that, which is a generic enough re-theme, but I just want to play around with the mechanisms in an interesting way. So I'm excited to try that one. The other one I'd like to try at some point is what's it called? It's like Hong Kong.
Blackout Hong Kong.
Yeah, Blackout Hong Kong, which the concept being that you're basically trying to kind of help control or like deal with the emergency of like a full blackout in Hong Kong. Help maintain the security and the medical emergencies and stuff like that. But it's a competitive game. So that one's got a kind of a cool theme that I'd like to try out. And I've heard good things about that one as well.
That one looks fantastic too. And I have to note that I think the cover art here is beautiful. And the artist for this one is, of course, Clemens Franz, who I give so much heed to.
Oh, man.
You look at this cover art, it has a beautiful palette. It has the blues going against the yellows and this city kind of at the edge of a lake and these mountains in the background with a sunset behind it. Nice job, Clemens Franz, with the art here. It's beautiful.
Let me just go one step further with the theme thing. I was joking before, but according to the Capstone website, the theme of this game, it says, with a group of pioneers, you have left civilization behind to settle along the shores of Boonlake, a long-forgotten region inhabited by humans long ago. And then you look at this box cover, and it is this really kind of interesting, I don't even know how to describe this sort of fanciful buildings that are on here with the water, and there's a lotus flower opening. But then what really caught my attention, which I can't make heads or tails of, if you look at the letters Boonlake, there's like a circuit board on them. So what does that mean? I have no idea, but I'm really fascinated by it.
Yeah, well, there's no link to the theme there, although I guess you do at some point start to develop up like to factories. So two other interesting things about that. One is that the first player token in this game is that lotus flower, but it's nowhere else in the entire game. So we were looking and we're like, why is this even here? And then I look at the cover of the box. I'm like, okay, because it's the art on the cover of the box. One of the dumbest first player tokens I've ever seen. But otherwise, I actually really enjoyed the production. It's got a beautiful production, great like dual layer player boards, and everything worked really well. Looks really nice. Lots of great colors. But the other thing is that it mentions an ancient civilization used to live here. There's really no talk of like colonization from a perspective of like you're coming in and taking over someone else. But there's one little element mechanically, and that in very few places around the board, you can pick up these vases. They look like antique vases. And I think the idea being that like this lake is dried up and you're starting to discover some ancient artifacts from like, hundreds of years ago. But it's such a weird link because like you're playing in this old West town and then there's like these antique vases in there with no other, like thematic link to them. But it's kind of neat. It adds this one very rare resource that you only get them in these places, and very rarely do you need them, but it can give you powerful effects if you use them. So kind of clever. I don't know, very kind of a weird choice of theme here, but and again, a couple too many mechanisms in here that just didn't really add to the game, and you could have caught a couple things. It would have been a little more streamlined, but I still had a great time playing, and I would be happy to play this anytime. I probably, I don't need another heavy Euro game that nobody around me is going to play, and I know some people around here that have it, so I probably won't buy it, but I really like this game. I think it's worth a try. If you like kind of mid to heavyweight Euros, I think it's worth a shot.
As we transition to future takes, I have a game that's just been delivered. I haven't had a chance to play it yet, but I have it partially set up on my tail. I'm going to give a little teaser for They Live, Assault on Cable 54. This is by Andrew Atchison and Matt Lees. Not the Matt Lees from Shut Up and Sit Down, different Matt Lees. And the publisher is Iconic Studios. This is based on the old 80s movie where you throw on these sunglasses, these Ray-Bans, and then all of a sudden you can see who's an alien and who's not. Some of the components, there's these a little bubblegum box. The dice are bubblegum colored, and one side of them says kick ass, and that's like a quote from the movie the guy's always talking about. So just a lot of humor here. Some of my thoughts as I'm unpacking this thing. The production seems neat, but I'm also a little worried about it. It looks like there was these little, I don't know, the cards have these little chunks in the corner, like a little microchip looking thing that makes them all kind of uneven, so they don't necessarily stack up right. But the map is cool. It has all these kind of photos, and it's an abstract of LA, a map. So you're kind of hunting around LA. It's a co-op game. You're trying to find the aliens, defeat them all, and come out ahead. Looks like a lot of fun. I hope the gameplay carries through. I plan on playing this one, and I will report back. Chris, this seems like a game that you should have kickstarted, not me.
For real. And for anybody who was a fan of wrestling, professional wrestling, the WWF back in the 1980s, what a delight to see Rowdy Roddy Piper back in action, even if it's in a board game. I mean, my goodness, what else could you ask for?
This is a movie I missed. I was probably just a little bit too young for it at the time, and it must not have been popular enough in pop culture for me to need to go back to it, but now I feel like I have to. Adam, what drove you to this game? Was it just the components? Was it the t-shirt and the bubblegum dice? Or did you actually get excited about it? Like, were you a fan of the movie? Is that why you had to back it?
There was a few factors. One is that I think it was on HBO for a solid year or 2 years, and then it went off for like 2 months, and it came back again for like 5 more years. So I was home, at 10 years old, and this thing would come on and be like, oh, this is the movie with the sunglasses. And the guy like goes and shotguns all these aliens and saves LA. So if it was on HBO and it had some gore and I felt like I shouldn't have been watching when I was 10, of course I wanted to watch it and learn more about it. So that's part of the appeal here. And then just watching the Kickstarter was so fun, seeing these glasses, and it kind of has that Nemesis thing where you tuck the card in and, oh, there's an alien there. Same thing here. You don't know who's an alien and who's not until you get a certain stage and you tuck it in and you're like, oh no, this guy's an alien. What are we going to do? So the guys put a lot of their heart into it. I think this was a very much of a passion project for the designers. So anytime I see something like that, I'm going to take note and I'm going to be interested. And if it's at all interesting to me, I'm going to take the plunge. Why not go for it?
Nice. Chris, you got any future takes?
Yeah, sort of. I'm just going to have a little sad note here. I'm backing 2 games right now on Kickstarter from Petersen Games. One is Cthulhu Wars, the Daemon Sultan, and the other one is Hyperspace. And, we're coming up here not too long on this year's Kickstarter episode. And it reminds me of the conversations we've had. And Tim, I know you're not a big fan of Kickstarters generally, even though you back more of them by like a factor of 2 than Adam or I do. But all the times that I've heard stories about the failures of the companies that put out Kickstarters and ones that don't treat their customers well, and et cetera, and I never experienced that. I had so many good Kickstarter experiences that even in places where the games ended up not being everything I'd hoped for, I was really happy with the Kickstarter experience and watching things happen and just being generally thrilled with the process. And here we've got Petersen Games, which puts out one of my favorite games of all time, Cthulhu Wars. And I'm so disappointed in them for how they've handled these 2 games. I mean, for one, the games were funded back in, I think it was early 2019. So we're going on, 3.5 years now since these things were originally funded. And there's been this constant stream of excuses about this and that and COVID and shipping costs are going up and just this whole slew of stuff. And I get it. I mean, COVID happened. It's a big deal. It changed a lot of things. But I've also gotten a lot of Kickstarters that came in around that same time that delivered on time. I've had Kickstarters that I ordered after those that have delivered on time. I have ones that I'm ordering now that are still continuing to get delivered on time. And it's so frustrating. And this is just kind of an epitaph. It's a really sad experience for me that I finally had my first big, epic Kickstarter fail. So thanks for nothing, Petersen Games.
Chris, I'm in the exact same boat as you. I've backed Hyperspace and the Daemon Sultan largely because of playing Cthulhu Wars with you and having so much fun with it and seeing all the things. Now, did you back that original one on Kickstarter? Did you get that retail? How'd you get a hold of that original?
I got the base game retail.
Okay. So yeah, I'd heard okay things. Sometimes Petersen Games a little late to deliver, but yeah, eventually they'll deliver. And maybe they will, maybe they won't, but I will never buy a product from Petersen Games ever again after going through this experience. Absolutely not. It's been disgusting to get these emails and get these updates, whether it's video or not. Having them, we got an email on Labor Day about how they fired all their employees. That's a classless. Mind-blowing the way that he's handled himself, the way the company's handled themselves. And it's just a frustration all around. Absolutely sick of this company. One of the other things that disgust me about these campaigns, there was a pledge tier called An Inhabitant of Carcosa for $1,800 or more. And you're supposed to get, some people actually did this. I feel sorry for the poor guys. The deal was they had the pleasure of going to Sandy Petersen's residence in Texas and touring the house and play testing these games. To me, this is clearly just a money grab. I have not seen anything like this on any other Kickstarter. And what do they do with it when they squander it? They can't claim innocence in what they're doing here.
Glad I didn't back it. I think there's a clear sign that Sandy Petersen was running this like a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's paying himself probably a decent salary and basically saying like, hey, I don't have the money to, to print this one, but that's okay. I'll run another Kickstarter. That'll cover the money for this one and I can ship that out. But ultimately, he's gotten so far behind that he stopped shipping things out. He's been paying himself a salary for years, and now he's telling people, like, I can't afford to send this. Yeah.
Frustrating.
Very frustrating.
Well, since I introduced this really downer of a topic, I do want to throw in a fun fact about dogs because we were talking about foxes. Fun fact about dogs. Most animals, if you point, they'll look at your finger. Dogs, more than almost any other animal, if you point, will look where you point. And that, my friends, is breeding.
Great fact, Chris.
All right. Well, I think that will wrap up this show. I do have one more, high point to end on, and that is that we got a really nice review on Apple Podcasts this week. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. We love seeing these. If we go a couple weeks and I don't get any reviews and I start to wonder, what did we do wrong? Why doesn't anyone like us anymore? So it's really lovely when we get to when somebody leaves these nice comments and shows that the work we're putting in and is paying off. We got a great review in Canada this week on Apple Podcasts. This was from MDP McLean. I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but that's kind of how it looks to me. McLean? No, probably not. It's probably MDP McLean. I think that works, yeah. They said, great content and group, 5 stars. BGHT does such a great job with their content. The reviews strike the right balance of structured reflection and fun banter, and each person brings us a distinct perspective to offer a well-rounded view on a game. Their non-review episodes, example given the best, worst combat mechanisms, address some interesting topics too. It's also been fun to see the group's dynamic develop over time, the friendly ribbing, recurring jokes, etc. The whole crew is likable, the kind of people I'd want to share a pint with during a game of Eclipse and after. I look forward to the many future takes to come. I'd be particularly curious to hear their takes on Dead Reckoning and Suburbia. In any case, keep up the great work and thanks for the content. Thank you so much. I just love hearing this stuff. This makes me so happy. I can't believe you all are listening and enjoying the show this much. But by the way, I've never played Dead Reckoning or Suburbia, 2 games that I actually really like to play. So hopefully at some point they may be on a review list. So thanks for mentioning that. And if you'd like to mention any games you'd like to hear us cover, leave us a review, drop them in there, or just hit us up on Twitter. Follow us at BG_hot takes on Twitter. And we have definitely played games that some of our listeners have mentioned before because you were enthusiastic about it and excited about it. So more opportunities to do that. Until next week, take care, everybody.
Good night, all.
Bye-bye.